There were a couple of major streaks that happened this past year in the sporting world. You saw one of them, two major streaks that were broken in sports this year. One was the Chicago Cubs finally won a World Series. That was the moment. 2016 World Series champions. They broke a 108-year drought from being World Series champions. That was the longest time between World Series victories ever. In that period of time, to put that in perspective, here's some things that happened. Two major world wars, since the Cubs had won the World Series. The TV was invented. The internet was invented by Al Gore. We put a man on the moon. The polio vaccine was created. The Wright brothers took their first flight. So all those things happened during the Chicago Cubs 108-year drought from winning the World Series. The second major sporting event streak that happened was by the University of Connecticut women's basketball team. They won 111 straight games, which is unheard of in major sports, even college sports. And that streak was broken in the NCAA tournament by the Mississippi State women Bulldogs. Broke 111 straight game winning streak. So two major streaks kind of from opposite perspectives. A positive one, World Series champions after 108 years, and a negative one, 111 straight games broken in the NCAA tournament. We're starting a series today on an Old Testament character, a prophet named Elijah, who is one of the most popular characters in all of the Bible. He's mentioned 30 times in the New Testament, so that should let you know how popular the prophet Elijah was. He's mentioned more times than some of the kind of big name Old Testament people. But when we come into the story of Elijah, we are introduced to him in the middle of a streak. Now, it's a different type of streak, as we'll learn, but it was a significant one nonetheless. And so we're going to drop into the story of Elijah. I'm going to kind of tell you what was going on in the life of God's people, the Israelites, and then we'll start putting some pieces together. But today we're going to kind of motor through some history to help you understand why this prophet was so crucial during the time that he came onto the scene, and hopefully we can keep it engaging and then apply it to our everyday lives. So if you know the story of Israel, you know that there was a time when they had no king. And they decided they needed a king like every other nation. And so they began to beg God to give them a king. God said, "You really don't want a king?" And they said, "No, we need a king like everyone else." And so God said, "Okay, have your way." And so he allowed them to have a king. Their very first king was a guy named Saul, who was head and shoulders above every other person. And they elected Saul king, and he had kind of mixed reviews in his kingship, some good days, some bad days. Saul was followed by what we know is probably the most popular king of all of Israel, of all of time, the one that really kind of signified a coming Christ, and the King of Kings in the Old Testament days before Jesus arrived, a guy named David, who's most known for killing a giant named Goliath. David was a good king for the most part, had his up and down days as well. But King David was a significant historical king throughout Israel's history. This was followed by David's son, who many call the wisest man to ever live, Solomon, who wrote the book of Proverbs and Song of Solomon, which is not a book you want to read to your kids at night. But the King Solomon, who they call him wise, but I'm not sure a guy that had 700 wives could be labeled wise. I have one wife, and so I can't imagine 700. But Solomon was the next king. And so three kings, Saul, David, Solomon, and then everything goes amiss. It goes awry with Solomon's boys take over, the Boam brothers, Jeroboam and Rehoboam. And what happened with the Boam brothers is basically a civil war ensued in the nation of Israel. The nation became divided into two nations, 10 tribes to the north, two tribes to the south. The northern tribes were called Israel, kept the name Israel. The southern tribes became known as Judah. Both Israel and Judah eventually fell to international foreign powers, basically because of the judgment of God. So let me tell you a little bit about those two nations. Israel, which was the northern nation, they existed for about 200 years before they were taken into captivity. During that time frame, Israel had 19 kings. 19 kings of Israel, the northern half, 19 kings, all of them, 19 out of 19, 100%, all 19 kings were wicked. All evil kings. And all of us Southern people said, those Yankees, of course they were all evil. Northern Israel had to be modern New York City, right? All evil kings, 19 out of 19. In the year 722 BC, they fell to the Assyrians. The Assyrians came in, demolished them, took them into captivity. The southern kingdom was known as Judah. Judah existed about 300 years before they went into captivity. So 3 centuries of existence. They had 17 kings. Now, before we get all hyped up about the southern kingdom, out of the 17, 8 of them followed God. So their streak was not much better, less than 50% followed God. And the other 11 were evil kings. In 586, they fell to the Babylonians. 586 BC. Now, if you know the story of Israel at all, you know that they were in captivity for about 70 years. Eventually, they returned to Jerusalem. They rebuilt the temple. They rebuilt the city. They restored worship. That would be the Old Testament books. Their leaders were Nehemiah. You've heard of that guy. Ezra. And then one of my favorite names in the Bible to pronounce, a guy named Zerubbabel. Man, that's just fun to say, isn't it? Zerubbabel. You want to say it with me? I can tell you're tempted. All right, let's all say it together. 1, 2, 3. Zerubbabel. Feel free to name your kids that. So Nehemiah, Ezra, Zerubbabel, they restored worship and reestablished Israel. During the midst of all of this time, God sent prophets to both nations. Those are a lot of kind of those big and small books at the end of the Old Testament. We call them the major and minor prophets, the Isaiahs and the Jeremiahs, and then all those little guys, the Hezekiahs and the Zephaniahs and the Malachi's and the Obadiahs. Seems like a lot of their names ended in Ayah, right? And so that was kind of the major and the minor prophets that God was using to bring a message of repentance to his people, calling the kings and the people back to God. Obviously, they didn't listen very well. 19 kings, all of them evil. 11 out of 18, all evil. And so did not listen very well. And God was sending prophets. Now, we have to be honest, the prophets were kind of weird. They dressed weird. They were nobodies. They spoke kind of weird language that people didn't understand. They were largely ignored. Some of the prophets God called to do crazy things like walk around with no clothes on and all kinds of stuff that just kind of added to their weirdness. They dressed funny, looked funny, spoke funny, said funny things. They were not Auburn fans. Come on, stop. They were prophets. And God sent the prophets to speak to his people. Now, hopefully this history and the division of the nation of Israel kind of helps you understand. When you read the Old Testament, it can get very confusing because it's not like lined up chronologically. So what goes where? And as you read, you'll read about this king was reigning while this king was reigning. Well, if you kind of understand the breakdown of Israel and Judah, it kind of helps you understand when a king is introduced what was going on. So that divided history is very important for understanding the Old Testament, particularly books like Kings and Chronicles, where a lot of these things were happening. Well, in the middle of this streak of 19 evil kings, we are introduced to a king named Ahab. His story starts in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 29. In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, okay, so there's the divide. Judah is what was going on in the southern part. So Asa was ruling and reigning in Judah. Ahab, the son of Omri, began to reign over Israel. So there you see the divide, Judah, Israel. Ahab, the son of Omri, began to reign over Israel, and Ahab, the son of Omri, reigned over Israel in Samaria. That was the capital city, for 22 years. And Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. Important phrase. More than everyone before him. For 22 years, he was the most wicked king to date. Let me put that statement in context for you. I'm going to throw up a little picture of kind of the list of the kings so that you can kind of see this as I go through. We got that? There we go. This is the divide of the kingdom, so we're going to be looking primarily at Jeroboam, the Boam brothers. You can see the divide there. We're focusing in on Jeroboam. So Jeroboam, one of the evil Boam brothers, when he came on the scene, he introduced the worship of false gods that we call idolatry. He was very deceptive and very murderous, killed a lot of people. His son that followed him was a king named Naboth. He continued the idolatry of his father, and when the Old Testament writer writes about Naboth, it says that he made Israel to sin. So he was the leader that began to cause the people of God to follow false gods. He made Israel sin. Like, you don't want to have that as a descriptive phrase in your life. He made such and such, or a group of people, to sin. And so he kind of continued the legacy of his father. He was assassinated by a guy named Baasha. Baasha, to prove the validity of his rule and reign, decided that he would murder everyone from the bloodline of Jeroboam. And so again, these were big families, lots of people, men, women, children, and Baasha killed them all. He murdered them all, everyone from the bloodline of Jeroboam. And the text says that he began to provoke God. Like, that's not something you want to be labeled in your life. Provoking God. As a matter of fact, the prophet that was pronouncing judgment upon Baasha said that his family, that he provoked God so severely that his family would be eaten in the streets by dogs, and they would be eaten in the fields by birds. Like, whoever said the Bible was boring? Like, read these stories if you think the Bible is boring. Well, Baasha, again, his family was destroyed. He was actually followed by one of his sons named Elah. Elah was assassinated while he was hammered at a party. Got drunk, got assassinated at a party by his own commander, a guy named Zimri. Zimri decided he wanted to take over. The king got drunk. He took him out at the party, assassinated by him. So Zimri was basically a mass murderer who killed off an entire household of another murderer. So one mass murderer murdered all the family of an existing mass murderer. His reign lasted, ready for it, 7 days. 7 days, because the army heard what happened. They heard about the conspiracy that took place. They decided that they wanted to make Omri king, that we just read about in the text. They wanted to make Omri king. And so they go to the city where Zimri is, and they gather their forces. Zimri kind of realizes what's going on. He realizes his fate. And so what he does is he sets his own house on fire and burns himself alive after 7 days. Zimri, that's his legacy. And so then at that point, the people are divided in their loyalties. Some want Omri to be king. Others want Tibni to be king. So we have two leaders, Omri, Tibni. Again, the nation within the nation is kind of divided. Half want Omri, half want Tibni. So Omri says, look, I'll take care of the issue. I'll solve the problem. He solves the problem by murdering Tibni, his rival. He just takes him out. So that solves the problem. They make Omri king. Here's the descriptive phrase in the text about Omri. He acted more wickedly than all before him. That was Ahab's dad. And then Ahab comes on the scene, and we just read how the Bible described him. That puts some historical context in place for you in understanding how wicked Ahab must have been. I mean, what a legacy. What a dynasty to step into of mass murder. When I was reading this, I wasn't sure if I was reading Old Testament history or getting ready to watch a new season of The Bachelor. Like, here's the candidate. Is there any father alive that thinks, I want my daughter to grow up and go on The Bachelor? If my daughter could just go on The Bachelor and have 20 men conniving and scheming and lying and trying to sleep with her all the time, man, what a father's dream to have your daughter show up on The Bachelor for the entertainment of the ladies in the room. Hopefully not the men. If you're a man watching The Bachelor, go ahead and turn in your card today. Unless you're making your wife happy, then you get a pass. If you watch it when your wife is out of town, though, you got to turn in your man card. The legacy that he stepped into: idolatry, murder, conspiracy, hatred, assassinations, immorality, deception, evil. I mean, this is literally a House of Cards episode on steroids, isn't it? I mean, stuff is happening like crazy. And this reign of iniquity began with the two Boam brothers, and it impacted 3 centuries of people. Leaders and people turned from God. They betrayed their covenant with God. These were dark, sinful times. And then Ahab and his infamous wife Jezebel take the throne. And there's no more notorious husband and wife team in all of Scripture than Ahab and Jezebel. I mean, they're the Bonnie and Clyde of the Bible. I mean, none of us, I don't know a single person named Jezebel, right? I mean, what a legacy even her name carries to today. You don't look at your bundle of joy daughter when they're born into the world and say, I've got the perfect name, Jezebel. People will love that name. And we're going to name our son Satan. I mean, that would be the same, right? So here's Jezebel and Ahab. For the very first time, we're introduced to a husband and wife in the text. Look at 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 29. We'll read through those verses again and then the rest of it. In the 38th year of Asa, the king of Judah, Ahab, the son of Omri, so we kind of have some context now for what that means, began to reign over Israel. Ahab, the son of Omri, reigned over Israel and Samaria 22 years. Ahab did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him, as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, like he didn't even think about it. It was a light thing for him just to continue to live like that. He took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal. See that name there? Ethbaal, B-A-A-L. That'll become important in our text. Ethbaal, the king of the Sidonians. And he went and served Baal and worshipped him. He erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. And Ahab made an Asherah. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. As we unpack the story of Elijah, we will learn that Ahab was selfish, he was a crybaby, he was sullen, he was cruel, he was morally weak, he was consumed with his own luxuries in life. And for the very first time, we are introduced to the wife of the monarch. None of the kings before Ahab were their wives even mentioned. But the biblical writer takes the time to introduce us to the wife of Ahab for 2 primary reasons. One, Jezebel was really the ruler. She was the one calling the shots, it's called petticoat government, right? Where a person's in charge, but really it's the spouse that's calling the shots. This is a classic example of that. Jezebel was the one that was really the puppet master, controlling the strings and really ruling and reigning in the name of her husband. She was the Lady Macbeth of the Old Testament. She was in charge and she was evil. The second reason that she's introduced into the text is because she initiates and promotes Baal worship, B-A-A-L, the god Baal. It was from her heritage. She was a Phoenician princess, the daughter of the king of Tyre. She married Ahab as a sign of peace and prosperity between the countries. So understand what was going on. This was a peaceful time in Israel and Judah. This was a prosperous time. They had more wealth than they had ever had. But this was an extremely evil, dark time. And so to kind of join forces, Ahab marries Jezebel. One of the requirements is that she required that her religion would become the national religion, that the worship of Baal would become the national religion. As a matter of fact, she maintained a guild of 450 prophets of Baal that will have a direct confrontation with the prophet Elijah. And she also had 400 more prophets dedicated to the god Asherah. And so again, she was committed to Baal worship to the point that she wanted to eliminate the worship of the true God, of Jehovah God. She wanted to have his prophets killed. There's an interesting little story about a guy named Obadiah. He's a small prophet at the end of the Old Testament. His book is only one chapter long. But Obadiah was a prophet that rescued 100 prophets of God, and he hid them in a cave so that they would not be destroyed, and he fed them while they were there. So just kind of an interesting little rabbit trail story. Again, there's nothing boring about the history of the Bible. But Jezebel had a direct and intentional allegiance to the false god Baal. Now, let me tell you about Baal. Baal was the false god of rain and fertility. He was named or labeled the rider of the clouds, meaning he was in control of the clouds. His wives and daughters were considered lightning and dew. They were his family members. He supposedly controlled the seasons, the crops, the land, the rain. Sacrifices to Baal were very gruesome. Some of the early images of the false god Baal would be of him holding his hands with a child. They would offer child sacrifices to the prophet Baal. And so everything about Baal was in direct contradiction to God. It was blasphemous. It was gruesome. They erected idols of Baal in the temple of Jehovah God. It was a direct assault upon Israel's God. So picture the scene. And when we picture the scene, realize it's not too far removed from some of the same things that we deal with today. Dark, sinful days. Man, do we live in a time of dark, sinful days? So much violence, so much evil, so much wickedness in our days. Just little things. Like I was thinking this morning early, Zach's been involved in a AAU basketball tournament this weekend that was supposed to be all day yesterday and then this afternoon, the deciding games. And we got a text late last night about 10:30 that said all the games, and this affects literally multiple hundreds of kids. All the games have been canceled because some adults got into an altercation and the Huntsville Police Department had to come, and so they canceled the entire tournament. Now, the good news for you is I got bailed out early this morning. That wasn't my joke. That's why it wasn't so great. Ross made that joke in the tech team. No, it wasn't me, but I thought like some adults got into a violent altercation, and for them to cancel the whole tournament, like it had to be a big deal. And so it impacted hundreds of kids. Like our media is filled with violence, and we promote open acts of wickedness and sin. We live in some very dark and sinful days, and it's at our fingertips, and it's on our computer screens, and it's on our television screens, and we do not have to go very far to read about the same types of immorality that we find in some Old Testament cultures. Different sins, but same sins at their nature. Very dark, very sinful times, very dark times, a time of moral crisis, and even our own worlds, right? Like, do you ever feel that your own world is a world that's been darkened and stained by sin? Maybe it's your sin, but you feel in a very dark place, in a very sinful place, even kind of in your context, in your world. And so Elijah enters an extremely dark and sinful time. It was also a culture that was driven by the promotion of false gods. Now, in our American culture, we do not see a lot of people bowing down to stone idols and things made out of metals or animals turned into false gods. We don't have a lot of what we picture as idolatry like that in our culture, but the truth is we continue to live in a day and age that is filled with the worship of idols. They just look different. They're not made necessarily of wood, metal, or stone. It may be a bank account, or it may be activities, or it may be anything and everything. Like I have told you before, idolatry is really anything that displaces the place of God in my heart. That becomes my idol. It can be my own children. It can be my spouse. It could be my significant other person, boyfriend, girlfriend in my life. It could be my job. It could be my house. It could be my car. It could be evil, sinful things in my life. But anything that displaces God in my life is really what idolatry is. And so that's why the first commandment has to do with idolatry, because every other commandment, even of the Big Ten, flows from the idea of who has top priority in your heart and life. And if it's anything, anyone other than God, you're involved in the sin of idolatry. And so we're not a culture that's driven by the same type of idolatry, but we are driven by the worship of false gods nonetheless. And when Elijah enters the scene, and when we jump into the text, it is a culture that reflects in a lot of ways the culture in which we live. It was also a culture with a lot of flawed human leaders. You know why? Because they were humans and they were sinners. Like, do we live in a culture of flawed human leaders? And before we think of names and titles and this person, that person, and point the finger, we're all kind of flawed humans, right? And we follow many times flawed human leaders that may or may not wear the title of president or king or whatever it might be, but we live in a culture that is consumed with flawed human leaders, and we look to people that cannot satisfy us. We look to people that really will let us down at certain times, and we look to people that will sin against us, and even ourselves, the people that we are leading, we are flawed human leaders as well, in desperate need of a Savior. And so we live in a culture that is different in some ways than the days of Elijah, but very similar to the days of Elijah. The Ahabs and the Jezebels are not limited to the Bible. They're all around us, and they're common in our culture. I guess if I was summarizing the culture of that day and the culture of our day, we are desperately sinful people like the Israelites, like the people of Judah. We are desperately sinful people whose hope is in a God that would provide a way of salvation, that would provide a redeemer. That's why the gospel flows throughout the entire narrative of the Bible, because it is driven by that thread of redemption, that people of every age and every era in both testaments are desperately sinful people who need intervention, who need redemption, who need salvation, who need a message of hope and forgiveness, who need a Savior. And that's the world in which Elijah lived. So into this dark scene, God sends a light. He sends a prophet named Elijah. What do we know about him? 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 1, we're introduced to this guy. Now Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, "As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word." We're introduced to Elijah. We don't know a lot about him. What we do know is, one, we know a little bit about who he was as a man, Elijah the man. His name, the name Elijah, actually means "my God is Jehovah," or "the Lord is my God." So even his name stands as a direct confrontation of everything that Ahab and Jezebel represented. So it lets us know that Elijah at least had parents who still believed in the Lord God Jehovah. They named their son Elijah. "My God is Jehovah." My God is not Baal. My God is not a false God. My God is Jehovah. The Lord is my God. His name proclaims, I have one God, and he is not Baal. He is the one true God. So even his name announces his belief. I believe there is one God, the Lord God, Jehovah. We also know that Elijah was from Tishbe. It's called Elijah the Tishbite. Now, honestly, that would be like me saying, I am Devin from Caddo, right? I live up in the Caddo area. The only thing that you know about Caddo is there's a cafeteria there. A lot of people eat at the Caddo cafeteria. I take my wife there when she needs just a good dose of true Southern cooking to the Caddo Cafe. Literally, Caddo is not known outside of just the vicinity in which it is. Same way with Elijah, who is the Tishbite from Tishbe. We know very little about Tishbe. Here's what we do know, and I love this. We do know that it was in Gilead. Gilead was the kind of the northern Transjordan area. If you're looking at a map, it's kind of a little bit over in the desert. It's the east side of the Jordan. Let me tell you about the people from Gilead. They were rough. They were rugged. They were leathery. They were coarse. Elijah was an outdoorsman. He was muscular. When you will get further into the text, he was crude at times. He was fiery. He was not refined. He was not sophisticated. He was not polished. You hearing what I'm saying? God sent a country boy to the king. God sent a rugged, leathery country boy. I almost picture Elijah like chewing tobacco when he's talking to Ahab. Like, to get the strength to go before the king, he ate a steak. Like, he ate some type of red meat or bacon or something before he went. I mean, if Elijah was alive today, he's wearing Magellan, right? He's wearing Duluth buck naked underwear. He's rugged. He's an outdoorsman. He is a nobody from the backside of nowhere. It's common for God to raise up the unexpected, the unqualified, the incompetent, the unprofessional, the insignificant. It's like God to use the unlikely to do something likely in his name. It's just like God to take someone from the backside of nowhere to stand before the king. It's just like God to raise up a shepherd boy to fight a trained warrior named Goliath. It's just like God to pull a captain out of a cave and whittle his army down to 300 nobodies to fight an army of hundreds of thousands of men. It's just like God to use a Gideon. It's just like God to use a David. It's just like God to use a stammering, stuttering, runaway murderer on the backside of the desert to stand before Pharaoh and say, "Let my people go." It's just like God to raise up a nobody to stand before the most wicked king in Israel's history. It's just like God to use someone of average to below average talent. Man, we're in a room of people that we are people of average talent, below average talent. We're ordinary people. We're not kings and monarchs. We all have our own gifts and talents, and we all have our own influence or lack of influence. We're all at different places in life, but the gospel story is the gospel of God raising up individuals. It's God raising up nobodies from nowhere. It's God raising up people that our culture considers insignificant, that have very little influence. It's just like God to take ordinary people to do extraordinary things. And here's why. Because when that happens, guess who gets the glory? God gets the glory. It's all about God. The prophets were weird people. The prophets dressed funny and smelled funny and said weird things. They were largely ignored by the world in which they live. And yet time and time again, God raises up prophets to proclaim his message. Unlikely people. Elijah, the man, an ordinary man, just like us. But let's listen to his message. His message was very straightforward. No nonsense. Very to the point. Matches who he is, right? That's his personality. I mean, he's not dressed in royal garb from all indications. He probably looked a lot like John the Baptist in the New Testament, just kind of this crazy guy dressed funny that came out of the desert. And he proclaims a very straightforward message. Look back through the text, and we need to break this down because it's important. He says, first of all, as the Lord God of Israel lives, when he stands before the king, the most wicked king and his wife, when he stands before Ahab and Jezebel, who have all the power and all the authority and are seeking the death of God's prophets, when he stands before the king and queen, he says to them, what I want you to know is the Lord God of Israel lives. My God is the only true God. The God of Israel is the only true God. Notice what he says, the God of Israel. Israel has run away from God. Israel's broken their covenant with God. Israel is evil. Israel is wicked. But Elijah reminds them, in spite of our wickedness, in spite of our evil, in spite of the fact we have broken the covenant with our holy God, he is still the God of Israel. We're not the people of Baal. Even when we forsake God, he's still our God. We are the people of Israel, and he says he is alive, right? I mean, what a direct assault upon Baal. You could see Baal. He couldn't see you. You could point your finger and say, there's Baal, but he couldn't hear you say it. He was an idol made of stone. And Elijah says, I just want you to know the Lord God of Israel is alive. By the way, he's going to save this little bit of trash talk for a little later in a big showdown on Mount Carmel. He's going to bring this back to their attention in a little more of a crude way when the showdown happens. But he says right out of the gate, I just want you to know the Lord God of Israel is alive. And then he says, it is this God before whom I stand. I'm not standing before you, Ahab and Jezebel, Physically, I am, but the person that I'm standing before in reality is God. That's why I can stand here with authority. That's why I can stand here not afraid for my life. That's why I can stand here and bring God's message, because ultimately, whatever you choose to do with this message, whatever you choose to do with the messenger, I am standing before God. And He is more powerful than Baal. He's more powerful than you, Ahab. He's more powerful than you, Jezebel. He is my God, and it is before that God that I stand. Remember the disciples in the New Testament when they arrested them and hauled them before the kings? They said, Peter and John, you got to stop preaching this message. You got to stop telling people that we killed Jesus and God raised him back to life. And Peter and John say, you know what? You can try to shut us up and you can let us go. But I can tell you, when my feet hit the street, my message will not change, because I don't give ultimately account to you. I give ultimately account to the Jesus that was raised back to life. I give account to God and God alone. Elijah says, I am not afraid of you. I answer to God. Elijah is drawing a line in the sand. And just to confirm it, look what he says. There shall be neither dew nor rain. That's the wives and daughters of Baal. There shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. Suddenly Elijah's a weatherman, and he's speaking with absolute certainty. Is there anything that is the opposite of a weatherman than the words absolute certainty? I mean, how long ago was it that we let every kid in the state of Alabama and the near South out because the weather people said a certain type of storm is coming? Didn't show up at my house, but my kids had an awesome day out of school. Did that happen at your house too? Seems like it's happened a lot since I've been living in the state of Alabama. Weather people cannot speak in absolute terms. They can guess. I lived in the desert. Look, 99% of the time, I always thought the weather people in the desert had the most cush job on the planet. Like 5-day forecast is always like sun, 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 sun. No clouds even. It's just 5 days of suns. The only thing that might change is 104, 105, 103, 113. The predictability of the average temperature might change a little bit, but it's pretty much the easiest job on the planet. Sunny again today. Welcome to the desert. A little different here in the South. Elijah proclaims with absolute certainty, there will be no rain, there will be no dew for years until I speak the word. Baal is the weather god. Baal supposed to control the rain. Here's what Elijah is saying in this moment of showdown. Baal or no Baal. It's time to put up or shut up. Baal is a true God or he is not a God. Now let me tell you what no rain meant for that culture. It was literally an economic shutdown. This culture relied in this arid climate on rain and dew to happen. It would be the equivalent of, in American culture, saying there's going to be no fuel, there's going to be no money, there's going to be no jobs, there's going to be no food. Sounds like the Jimmy Carter era. I'm just kidding, man. I'm like all over the place today. No food, no gas, no jobs, no money. That's what it meant in that culture to say no rain, no dew. And we'll see that in the weeks to come, how devastating it was upon the people there. Elijah was a man chosen by God with a message from God. But this story is not about Elijah. Elijah is not the hero. This story is about the God of Elijah. Remember about Old Testament stories. The people are flawed. They're sinful people. And we'll see that in the story of Elijah. He was a prophet. He was a man of prayer, a man of faith, but he's not my primary example. He's not my hero. because Elijah falls short. I have one hero. I have one that I look to. I have one example that I will follow, and his name is Jesus, because he did not fall. He did not stumble. He did not lack in faith. He did not lack in courage. He did not run and hide. He did not pout and whine. He faced the enemy head on, and he did it with a true and pure heart. Jesus is always the hero of our story. Now, we can learn from Elijah. We can learn the good and the bad, but Elijah should always point us to the gospel. He should always point us to Jesus. God is always the hero of the stories. It's always about God. It's not about Moses. It's not about Abraham. It's not about David. It's not about Ruth. It's not about the prophets. It's not about the judges. It's always about God. The stories are always pointing to God. They're always pointing to the God behind the person. And the story reminds us that the God that we serve uses ordinary, flawed people to bring his message. God's story of redemption is always filled with insignificant people doing significant things to point people to the absolute power of God. And let's not forget, Old Testament stories, they're always got flawed humans in them. They're always about the God of the people. And Old Testament stories are always moving us toward Jesus. The trajectory of the Old Testament is always forward. It's always forward momentum. It's always pushing us toward a Messiah. It's always pushing us toward a Redeemer. As we make our way through the Old Testament, it's always pushing us forward, that there is one coming. There is one who is not flawed. There is a flawless Messiah who is coming that will face the real enemy. The story of Elijah is the story of a God who takes on his enemies and offers a way of salvation for his people. The story of Elijah is the story of a supreme, sovereign, jealous God who will not share his glory with false gods or evil kings or evil queens. He is the one true God, and that is the gospel. That's the story of Jesus. Baal does not control the weather. God controls the weather. Baal does not provide. Only God provides. Baal or any other false god is not in control. Only the one true living God is in control. Baal is dead. God is alive. There's an important reminder in our times, and the one central point of our text today is that there is only one true God, and he is in absolute control. Regardless of the sin around us and regardless of the sin in us, there is one God. He is the true God. And do not be confused. He is in absolute sovereign control. As the world falls apart around us, as the moral crisis happens around us, as the spiritual bankruptcy takes place around us and in us, remember, God is in control. There's lots of gods in our world, isn't there? There's lots of religions in our world, but there is only one true living God. Don't be confused. There's no Royal Rumble at the end of this thing to figure out who the true God is. There's no WWE-style supernatural divine wrestling ring at the end where we throw all the gods in and the true God is left. That's not how it happens. There's one God, the one true living God. He's not in competition with other gods. There is no competition. I've been reading through the book of Isaiah, which is at times difficult traverse through the book of Isaiah, trying to figure out who God's talking about, what kings, what nations. But here's the one thing that keeps coming up again and again and again in the book of Isaiah, who is a prophet that was speaking in similar times as Elijah. The one thing that comes up repeatedly in those 66 chapters is that there is one God. And that one God is in absolute, total, complete control. I read last week this phrase in Isaiah, where Isaiah the prophet is saying, look, if you're confused, don't be confused, because every other God, every other false religion is like the wick of a candle compared to the one true God. The wick of a candle. Every other world, religion, nation, king, queen, everything in this world is like the wick of a candle to our God. Meaning, all right, wet the fingers, douse the flame. That's how much God is in control of the world in which we live. There is one true living God. And we are still desperately sinful people whose hope relies, who rest in a God who provides a rescuer, a redeemer, a Messiah who would come and crush his enemies. Don't miss the point of the story. Elijah was a man of courage. He was a prophet, a man of faith and prayer. But at the same time, he was a man, a flawed, sinful human who struggled with doubt and insecurity and fear and depression and sin. Look at James 5:17, the brother of Jesus. He says in James 5:17, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. A man like us. A man with a nature like ours. Before we put him on a pedestal, before we lift him up as the example and say, pray like Elijah, be like Elijah, have courage like Elijah, before we put Elijah on the pedestal, remember, Elijah was a man like us. An ordinary, average, insignificant human being that served a God who is above all. A God who enables ordinary people to tell his story of rescue. Elijah stands boldly before a wicked king, a malevolent queen, and he proclaims a message of repentance and salvation, a message that will reach its climax in a few chapters in a face-to-face showdown on a mountain called Carmel. But before we get there, before we get to the showdown, God's going to take Elijah into seclusion. And in seclusion, he has an appointment with some ravens. A spiritual boot camp, you might say. And guess what? He might put you and me through the same process.